Hello and welcome back to the third round. You will have guessed from the thumbnail that by popular demand, we are again going to compare two locomotives today. If you follow the channel, you'll know that one of them doesn't belong to my collection theme. For anyone else, let me start today's video with a bit of context. I collect Märklin model trains in HO scale produced in the 1980s. Aside from my fondness for the product and an undeniable dose of nostalgia, the historical context also played a non-negligible role in my choice of collection theme. The 1980s are a decade when the company made the many changes required to shift away from toys in favor of models aimed at collectors and modelers. These changes laid the foundations on which the company still operates today, and I find this transition very interesting. Since the beginning of HO, what manufacturers had been selling were not just toys, but first and foremost a system. The aim was clear: lock the customer in to generate repeat purchases. As an early player with good marketing skills, Märklin managed to establish its own ecosystem, and saw no incentive in joining the two-rail bandwagon when it became fashionable in the 1950s. Märklin adopted a formula based on a few key ingredients: a well-engineered and easy-to-use track system, robust models fitted with highly standardized components, ensuring a consistent, reliable and predictable behavior on the track. This approach meant having to compromise on a few aspects, for example, detail. The models looked the part, but could be crude in places, as sturdiness always took priority over realism. The company made up for this with its pricing policy. Believe it or not, Märklin wasn't the most expensive among the premium brands of the time. This formula made it difficult for third parties. Märklin might have been one of the largest model railway manufacturers, but its track system wasn't the most widely used, so anyone wishing to enter this market would have had to also weigh in the economics carefully. As a result, whilst some manufacturers offered Märklin axles for wagons and coaches, only a few went as far as producing locomotives. Most of the time, the models filled gaps in the Märklin offering to avoid going head-to-head with the beast, but this was still a risky endeavour, as a Märklin release was almost guaranteed to beat any competing model. The industry has changed so much in this respect. Today's fast-paced, low-volume release cycles and the widespread adoption of standards such as NEM or digital protocols have removed a lot of economic and technical hurdles. As a result, dozens of manufacturers now offer product for the Märklin system, and if you were looking to buy a specific locomotive, more often than not, you'd find a few to choose from nowadays. Such a choice would have been inconceivable in the 1980s, as there was very little overlap allowing a direct comparison. Context is important in this respect, as the quality of a model is more heavily influenced by its competition than customer feedback, despite what manufacturers would have you believe. So whenever I have to assess a new addition to my collection, I look at catalogues for equivalent three-rail models that could have been bought at the time, and I use auction listing pictures to evaluate differences in terms of realism and quality. Doing anything else would be like trying to compare apples and oranges as far as I'm concerned. Today we'll go one step further and look at the real thing. I bought this Liliput 10205, listed in the catalogue as a class 38 of the Deutsche Reichsbahn. And if you'd like, you can stay with me for a bit as I put it through its paces and see how it stands against its Märklin equivalent. Okay, we are nearly there. Final thing before we set off. If you enjoyed this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe and alert button before leaving today. You can also leave a comment, which I absolutely adore reading. Super thanks are also available if you feel the content deserves it. Whatever the option you choose will be much appreciated. Many, many thanks. Now, on to our topic. Established in 1947, Liliput is one of the many European model railway manufacturers that appeared at the end of the Second World War. For the next 45 years, the company would be operating out of factories located in Vienna, in Austria. Financial troubles led to a brief partnership with Herpa in the late 1980s, very early 1990s. The company was then acquired by Bachmann plc and its production was moved to the Far East. Bachmann still owns the brand today. Due to this history, models are categorized by collectors based on company ownership. The model we'll be looking at today belongs to the Liliput Vienna era that covers anything produced before the late 1980s. In the early days, the company made tin-plate railway models compatible with the Trix Express 3-rail DC system. It adopted plastics in the early 1950s and switched production to a 2-rail DC system in 1956. Over time, it also released Märklin 3-rail versions of its products, occasionally at first, then almost systematically from the late 1970s onwards. The Prussian P8, or Baureihe 38, was an important model for Liliput. Its 102 was released to much fanfare as early as 1958. The tooling was tweaked a bit for the 1959 catalogue year. This version remained on sale, unchanged until the model was discontinued. Until the late 1960s, the company remained alone in producing models of this class. Liliput reused its tooling for many versions in several liveries over the years. In 1962 for an American-style loco, model number 106. In 1964, model number 105, a Deutsche Bundesbahn model with tub tender and small wind deflectors. In 1966, model number 102A, this time it's a P8 in Prussian livery. And in 1969, model number 108 in an Austrian ÖBB livery. In 1971 or maybe 72, the Liliput numbering system changed and the base model became the 10200. The 10205 we are looking at today is a 3-rail version of this model and was released in 1975. The only difference with the 10200 are the pickup shoe and the reversing unit. So despite the new reference number, the model was almost 20 years old in 1975, but it was the only Deutsche Reichsbahn Class 38 available for the Märklin 3-rail system at the time of release. Both 2- and 3-rail versions were sold until 1984. We'll be comparing the 10205 with Märklin's 3099. It was released in 1977 and produced until 1987. As of 1988, the 3099 reference became a Deutsche Bundesbahn version, which was sold until 2003. But the tooling is also older here, as it was first developed for model number 3098 in Deutsche Bundesbahn livery with a tub tender in 1967. Märklin also released both of its models in 2-rail versions under the Hanau brand. The 3098 was sold under reference number 8398 and the 3099 was sold under reference number 8399. The 3099 was one of the first in a new line of Deutsche Reichsbahn-themed models Märklin released in HO that year. I consider this line to be the first, albeit cautious, step in the company's transition from toy to model, something I mentioned in the introduction. So at time of release, both models were far from being spring chickens. Let's talk money. I could only find 1979 prices for the Liliput version, which would have set you back 80 Deutschmark, the equivalent of 115 euros today. The same year, the Märklin version had a recommended retail price of 117 Deutschmark, which would represent 165 of today's euros. I would say these prices placed both models at either end of the mid-range price bracket at the time of release. It is also worth mentioning that Liliput considered the 10200 and 10205 as simple models since the introduction of another P8 tooling in the early 1970s. There was no Reichsbahn version made, but other models based on this new tooling were offered at the same price as the 3099. So the scene is set. Two BR38s that could have been bought at the same time, and the only Deutsche Reichsbahn options available for the Märklin 3-rail system until Fleischmann joined the race in 1989. Now, let's have a closer look at the models. Let me finally take the Liliput model out of its box. It's not very heavy. Liliput states a weight of 360 grams in the catalogue. Full disclosure, I didn't spend much money on this, and the model is not in perfect condition. I did wash the body to present the model under the best light possible, though. Okay, now that it is on a presentation rail, it certainly looks like a P8 with the modifications made by the Deutsche Reichsbahn in the 1930s. The model is made of plastic, and I think the locomotive chassis is made of metal. I think it's die-cast. So, we have the large wind deflectors of type Wagner. We have the front dome, and a nice little tender. I wasn't too sure about the tank at the back, so I had to look things up. And here are a few pictures of the real thing I found in the process. This one was taken in 1931 with the Rheingold in the background, legendary train. But what's more interesting for us is the foreground, where we can see a group of P8s all fitted with this type of tender. Now, the Reichsbahn also used different tenders, like here in 1933 during a measurement run, or here in Berlin in 1937 on its way to Stralsund on the Baltic Sea with a higher capacity tender. Okay, let's have a look around. We definitely have plenty of characteristic details on show. These would be the ones popping out on black and white pictures like this one, or on factory photos. Let's look at a few of them. Liliput chose a flat cab configuration, and upon closer look, there is more going on than first impression might convey. We have openings, flaps, rows of rivets. The overall shape is, I think, nicely done. From the side, we can see that we have a see-through cab, and we have plenty of detail inside the cab too. Now let's look at the boiler. There again, we have plenty of detail on show. Almost everything is molded. I think the only separately applied element is the tank on the side. Maybe the pump as well, but I'm not sure. Anything silver is paint. Now let's have a quick look at the tender. Again, we are looking at plastic here, but we have rows of rivets where they should be. In addition to the tank at the back, we have a molded coal insert at the top. And here again, anything silver is painted on. Now moving on to the chassis, or the side view of the wheels. Aside from the correct representation of the axles positions, we have brakes everywhere, including on the pony truck at the front. I particularly like that bit we see now, with the two openings, which is very typical of the P8. The crosshead is cast by the looks of it, and Liliput painted the Kuhn slide lever to show us they put it there. I think it would have been red in real life, but it's a nice touch anyway. Lovely. Right, let's bring the Märklin 3099 in for comparison. The Märklin model is made completely out of metal for the locomotive, and the tender is mainly made out of plastic. There's a bit of metal in there. Looking at scale, the models are the same size by the looks of it. I mentioned earlier that the Märklin model was based on the 3098, which was a Deutsche Bundesbahn locomotive, and this shows. The locomotive has Deutsche Bundesbahn headlights, and the only difference with the 3098 are the markings and the wind deflectors. The boiler doors are different on both locomotives, but one mustn't forget that the P8s were, or at least some of the P8s were already about 25 years old in the 1930s. So there had been quite a few modifications made already, and quite a few types of doors were fitted to locomotives over the years. The light layout issue also applies to the tender, where we also have 3 lights. We have no tank here, but I'd give Märklin a pass. We've seen that the Reichsbahn used different tenders here and there. But Märklin gave us markings on the tender. We have another cab roof configuration on the Märklin model. Now this could have been seen in the wild already in the 1930s. Let me call up the picture we saw earlier. See? No problem. I think Märklin simplified the shape, as the original had side vents. It could have been a Bundesbahn modification too, but I couldn't find any picture, so we won't know for sure today. Now, let's try and have a closer look at a few elements side by side. We have see-through cabs on both models, and we can see that the Märklin model features Deutsche Reichsbahn markings on the left. On the boiler, we have a similar level of detail, but I think the definition on the Märklin side is a bit better. For example, the pump and the control arm look more realistic. If we move a bit further to the front, we can see the wind deflectors are simply flat on the Märklin side, whereas we have a few rivets and some holes on the Liliput model. Märklin does give us some cast rivets on the chassis though. And further down we'll notice the absence of brakes on the Märklin model. If we move along the chassis, we have a similar representation of the axle spacing at the back. But Liliput gave us some brakes everywhere here as well. Moving along a bit, we have the same level of detail on the valve gear, with the exception of the crosshead, which is made of folded sheet metal on the Märklin side. Now, in terms of overall execution, I think the Märklin model is ahead here. Let's look at the boilers again. We've seen we have a roughly similar level of detail, but if we look a bit closer, I think the Liliput details look a bit flat. Look at the relief of lines on the Märklin boiler. And now the Liliput model. And we also have a molding line across the entire length of the boiler on the top. Now, this difference in execution also applies in other places. For example, here on the sides. And if we have a closer look at the domes. So, at this stage, I am pulled in two directions. The Liliput model is clearly ahead in terms of fidelity to the prototype, but it was already showing its age at the time of release, and it feels a bit like a case of quantity over quality. The Märklin model is ahead in terms of overall quality and execution, but at the end of the day, it is still a Deutsche Bundesbahn locomotive in disguise. This puts both locos on an even level in my view. But looks are only part of the story. Let's move to the layout. And there we are. So let's first check how the models are put together. Liliput first. The body is clipped onto the chassis and held down by a screw in one of the domes. So we'll loosen it. It is quite a long one, as you can see. Then the body needs to be unclipped, pulling at the front first, then pushing it backwards. There we go. Now the tender. It can be opened from the top by loosening two screws hidden under the coal load. There we go. So we can see that we have a DC motor fitted to the locomotive. It drives one set of wheels via a worm gear. Nice little surprise, the motor is a 5-pole motor, so it should crawl nicely. We'll see a bit later. We have two light bulbs at the front. Looking at the tender, we have an electronic reversing unit. Now, this bit and a piece of tape are not original. I had to replace the unit with another one from my spares. Here's the broken one that was fitted when I bought the locomotive. I think these reversing units tend to be quite unreliable, at least judging by the forum posts I could find on the topic. The one I fitted is a later unit from Rocco, I believe. Looking at the locomotive chassis, we have traction tires fitted on the front driving axle. The chassis is die-cast with added plastic details, and the front pony truck is made of plastic. The tender chassis is completely made out of plastic. We can see that time has not been good for that part, and that it has developed a bend. This also seems to be a common thing on a lot of Liliput P8s of this vintage, whatever the tooling. I have seen quite a few online listings with this defect. Now let's have a look at Märklin. Most of you will know it, but we'll go quickly over a few things. Here we have a different approach. Technically, everything happens in the locomotive. The tender doesn't contain anything and can be uncoupled from the locomotive. It is made mostly of plastic with a bit of metal on the chassis, and there is also a weight inside. Let's have a peek inside the loco. We have a screw in one of the domes here as well, and after loosening it, the body simply lifts off. As you can see, everything is tightly packed in here. To be able to do this, Märklin placed everything back to front compared to what he would normally do. So we have the motor at the front and the mechanical reversing unit at the back. On the back of the motor, we have gears that transfer the power to all driving axles. See all the gears behind the wheels? While we are here, if you ever need to access the motor on one of these locomotives, part of the valve gear will have to come off. This is done by loosening a single screw, this one. The valve gear can then slide out of the cylinders, and the motor cover plate will be accessible. This model is fitted with a 3-pole flat collector motor, the small one. It's a type of motor Märklin had started to phase out on new toolings at the time. Alright, in terms of the bodies, the Märklin model is die-cast. Listen to that lovely sound. The pump and tanks on the side are plastic. The details on the boiler are all cast, aside from the outlet valve for the water pre-warmer at the top near the cab, and maybe that bit at the front. Is this a steam whistle? No idea. Leave a comment if you know what this is supposed to be. So I'll put this locomotive back together. Now the Liliput model. Here we are in plastic heaven. Everything is molded. I am just checking for locating holes inside to see if I'm wrong. No, it doesn't look like it. The feel and construction reminds me of a Märklin 3003. Here's a spare body. See, it has the same look and feel, and the quality of the details is similar. Anyway, the locomotive body is made of two parts, the boiler and cab on one side, and the wind deflectors and lights on the other. Looking at the tender, I don't think what I have here is original. We have this weight, it is bent to fit, but it looks a bit too messy to be a factory part in my opinion. I also don't know where it is meant to go, but it is needed in any case, at a minimum, to counteract the effect of the bent chassis on the adherence of the tender. As with Märklin, the tender is made of plastic. Alright, let me put everything back together. Okay, time for some action. I have serviced the locomotive as best as I could. I cleaned the commutators and brushes, and applied oil to all lubrication points listed in the service sheet. Let's check if my handiwork is still operational. Yes, the reverser is still working. So, time for some power. And we are going forwards. The lights are operational. And now backwards. It's not the quietest of models. Now let's try a crawl. The 5-pole motor should help here. Look at that. And we are barely above the stop position on the transformer. Very nice. Now, Märklin. So we've got the typical mechanical reversing unit music. Let's move forwards. Got the triple headlights on show. And backwards. It's a bit noisier. Now let's try a crawl. Look at that. Same transformer setting as the Liliput. And the flat collector motor is definitely helping a great deal here. Alright, now let's look at the stopping characteristics. The 3099 behaves like most Märklin models of the era. We are stopping rather abruptly by today's standards, but the locomotive still has a bit of inertia, which softens the stop. Now Liliput, and here we are stopping dead, which is to be expected with a worm gear transmission, but that is not good in the Märklin ecosystem of the time. This is not too much of a problem in manual operations, but with automation it is a recipe for derailments. Alright, now let's get some rolling stock. I have taken a few coaches out that were released at the same time as the Märklin model, or around the same time in 1977 and 78. These coaches were available throughout the 1980s. We have a luggage van, it's reference number 4142, an express coach, it's reference 4141, and a few ex-Bavarian coaches, which are all the same reference, it's 4136. Now I think this is a reasonable consist, maybe a bit too heavy for trains of the time with a P8, but it should allow us to get a good idea of the performance of each locomotive under load. In any case, these were the only few Reichsbahn choices available from Märklin at the time. Let's see how Liliput behaves. We are going to try and gently accelerate. Look at that. Not bad, isn't it? Now let's try Märklin. Well, it's not bad either. Now, let's compare the behavior in various areas of the layout. The transformer is set to speed setting 100. So we'll look first at the straight line in one of the stations, Liliput, and now Märklin. Now let's try some curves. Radius 2 first, Liliput first again, and now Märklin. Now let's look at radius 1, Liliput first, and Märklin. Well, I'd say that both locomotives maintain an even speed. The Liliput is noticeably slower, which is down to the gearing and transmission. Okay, now the ramp. Liliput first. It keeps its speed. There might be a tiny bit of deceleration, but we remain stable until the train has engaged on the elevated section. Now, going down the ramp, we can see the worm gear at work. It locks a couple of times as it goes down. Let's do it again with no comment. Not ideal and a potential source for derailment. Now Märklin. We are fine on the ramp, maybe a very slight deceleration. Yes, nothing to report here. And going downhill, we have the typical runaway effect. Alright, time for a torque test. Now, the slowest the Märklin locomotive can climb the ramp with that consist is at transformer setting 75. For your information, the gradient is at 3%. Now with this model we have an initial deceleration, then the speed remains relatively constant until the train reaches the curved section at the beginning of the elevated section. And then it picks up speed again. Now Liliput. Here we have the same slowest transformer setting at 75. I can't go any slower. And the speed remains constant as well. But the locomotive negotiates the curve better. But it's struggling a bit here. Alright, enough torture. Let's follow the Liliput on the track for a bit. We'll go a bit slower as well. So, we have seen the only Deutsche Reichsbahn BR38s available for the 3-rail system between 1977 and 1984. There was a price difference between the two, and I must say that Liliput certainly gave you a lot for the money. And the locomotive wouldn't have looked out of place when used at the same time as its Märklin rival. I was certainly surprised at the amount of detail on show, making this model the closest to the prototype. The presence of a 5-pole motor was also unexpected, which gives the model very good low-speed performance. The Märklin model is on par in this respect though. In combination with the worm gear, this motor also allows the model to maintain a realistic speed. But we have a few negatives. The model misses the mark as far as some of its driving characteristics are concerned. There is the behavior on ramps going downhill, the stopping behavior, and the model is also quite sensitive to contact loss on the track. These might have been a minor annoyance for manual drivers, but anyone using signals or automated operations would have found this infuriating. I don't think this aspect would have been any different on other Liliput P8 models, even the updated tooling, as the same locomotive chassis was shared across all P8s of the time. Liliput also missed a trick by not using an automatic coupling on the tender. The Class 38 was used for everything, and this model would have been very nice to use in a shunting area with automatic uncouplers. The fixed hook coupling also lacks slack and can cause derailments. Cosmetically, the definition of the mouldings is not up to what was common at the time. The model was already showing its age in 1977. It feels a bit like looking at a low-resolution picture. There is plenty on show, but everything is a bit fuzzy. So given the choice at the time, I wouldn't have been able to look past these negatives. However prototypical the Liliput model might have been at the time, it simply didn't integrate well enough in the Märklin ecosystem, and as a result I would have rather spent 30% more and chosen to live with the A-shaped lighting and the missing tank on the tender of the Märklin model. That was it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video, hopefully enough for you to give it a like, and maybe subscribe if you haven't already done so, or even send a super thanks my way if you feel the video was worth it. Thanks as ever for all your support, and bye for now.